Welcome to the City of Sydney's History Week talk today. My name is Layla Elmus and I'm the City Historian at the City of Sydney. So today we're presenting a hybrid talk. I'm just going to adjust my microphone a little bit so you can hear me okay. Is that all right? Just testing, 1, 2, 3. Sorry about this. We're just working through a little bit of technical issues. We've got a hybrid talk today. So we've got some people here in the room with us at Darling Square Library. Thank you so much for joining us. And we've also got some people joining us online via Zoom, via webinar. And we're just trying to adjust the sound levels just so that the people listening at home or wherever they are have the optimum sound levels. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. I think it's okay, but I'll just wait till our technical person gets back before I get started on delivering the talk. But I will just say, is that okay? All good? Sorry about the disruption there, everyone. So this week is History Week. History Week is coordinated by the History Council of New South Wales. So there are different events happening all over the state this week. If you haven't seen the full calendar of events, please do check out the History Council of New South Wales website because and I think if you just do a search for History Week, those list of events will come up for you there. So I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that we live, learn and create on Aboriginal country, as Aboriginal people have done for thousands of years. And today I'm speaking to you on Gadigal country, which is part of the Eora Nation. And so I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and to also extend a warm welcome to any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. So next up, I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping, and that's a lot of the housekeeping actually is for the people joining us online, but also for some people in the room here. So we are recording today's talk, and we are exploring a number of ways that we might share the recording in the future. Do keep an eye out for the YouTube channel, which is managed by the History Council of New South Wales. The best way, we've still got some people coming into the room for those people at home, which is all great. We're just going through the housekeeping. The best way to view the talk if you're coming to us via Zoom is to choose Fit to Window, which is in the View Options drop-down at the top of your screen. We don't have any Auslan interpreting today. This is due to unforeseen circumstances, so we do apologise for this inconvenience. We do hopefully have some time for questions if you have any, and we will do these at give time for these at the end of the talk, and you can put your questions in the chat if you're listening via Zoom. And that should hopefully, a lot of people would be very skilled up in how to use Zoom these days. I think we're having some microphone issues.
I think we're going to switch to these. Sorry about that.
All right. So, TK, given the technical issues, do I need to run through the housekeeping and the other things again, or? Okay, testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, jolly good. All right, so I might just quickly from the top run through the housekeeping. So we're recording the talk today. We're looking into different ways that we can present it to you online. If you're coming to us via Zoom online, please use the Fit to Window function, which is at the top of your screen. We do not have any Auslan interpreting today. We do apologise for this. It's due to matters beyond our control. We will hopefully have time for questions at the end of the session, and there is a chat function if you're joining us by Zoom, but for the people in the room, you can just ask me your questions. If you are having any technical difficulties, you can post that in the chat as well, and some of our colleagues here will help us to respond and try and assist you. And the final thing to say is that we've created a short survey, and this is really so we can find out about your experience today. And so we're going to put up a QR code at the end of the talk. It'll be in the PowerPoint slide, which is actually more useful for people coming to us on Zoom, not so much in the room, but we're also going to send you a link to that afterwards. So now we're just going to get started on the talk itself. So I'm going to talk about the City of Sydney's oral history collection, how we present it online, and our overarching collecting principles before showcasing some of the different ways that the collection has been used over the last decade. The City of Sydney's oral history collection contains more than 500 recorded interviews, and historians at the city have been generating oral history since really the late 1980s. And this has been part of a program of research, publications, websites, and exhibitions. In fact, the earliest interviews in our collection have a date from the early 1980s, and these are interviews that came to us by donation about 5 years ago. And these interviews focus on two different parts of Sydney, so the southern suburbs of Sydney, and it's really looking at the industrial heritage of that part of Sydney, capturing voices that are, you know, long gone now to us, and also Darlinghurst. And that is an area that a lot of people associate with, I guess, the underbelly of Sydney. And so it's sort of interviews. It's actually a great collection with journalists and policemen and a few colourful figures. So the oral histories in our collection, as I mentioned, there's around 500. They've been collected for a range of purposes. Initially, the interviews were really as background research for histories that were written of local areas, in particular Chippendale and Surrey Hills. And later, we've got some oral histories in our collection that were used to write a history of Sydney's Chinese community. Over the years, interviews have been conducted with long-term City of Sydney staff and also some of our councillors. And we also have interviews in our collection with Sydney-siders, so Sydney residents. We also actually manage collections which have been created by other organisations. So we have a great collection of interviews about Millers Point. And also we have interviews by donation, and these are typically donated to us by individuals. And more recently, we do have purpose-generated projects which have been developed along thematic lines, and I will go into that a little bit in this talk. So formal collecting began around 15 years ago, and that was when the city appointed an oral historian at the city. And I'd just like to shout out to Margot Beasley, and she was the oral historian who really kicked off the management of the oral history collection. So when she started, you know, Margot's role was really responding to things as they arose. So being, I guess, reactive to things that came up. But as she was working at the city, the work that she did really began to focus on being a very active and ongoing collecting program that needed to be made accessible to the public. When I started out as a historian, a lot of local studies libraries had oral history collections which were on cassette tapes. And so you had to come into the library, get a cassette machine out, get your headphones on, and then that was the way that you would listen to the oral histories in the collection. I can remember that quite distinctly, going over to the library at North Sydney and engaging with their collection about the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But I guess, you know, with website presentation, there's other ways that, particularly online now, that we can present audio content. So as the work program shifted from being reactive to being proactive, this meant also that we then had to establish some collecting principles. And that's where questions of what and why began to arise. So I guess the thing is, you know, when you have a big collection of oral histories like we do, you need to have some collecting principles. So the central collecting principle for the city's oral histories is that interviews must be relevant to our local government area. That's the City of Sydney local government area boundaries. So, you know, if we have a, you know, potential interview candidate that doesn't have a link to our LGA, then that is not really for consideration for us. But certainly we might recommend another council might interview that person, or another institution, depending on the topic. So within that broad remit, so within the sort of local government area boundaries, the city's history team aims to select interview subjects that might not otherwise be covered in the written historical record. We do prefer not to replicate interviewees or topics already represented in other collections. So, for example, State Library or the National Library of Australia. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, we do accept interviews by donation, but again, only if they're relevant to our collection or collection principles. So saying all this, our guidelines are not rigid, and suggestions which are outside this criteria have been considered on a case-by-case basis. So we do keep an open mind around that. So the organising principles of the collection have also evolved over this period. So initially the collecting was informal and there were no arrangements for cataloguing or for permanent storage. But in more recent times, project-based collection and organisation of deposit of both old and new interviews was developed. And also we developed some systems for the storage, backup and retrieval of the interviews. So we have a system, an archival system called TRIM, and a lot of our interviews sit there and are catalogued in that way. Then not all of them are accessible to the public, I might add. So web-based presentation of our oral histories saw another shift in organising principles. And this was you know, we were collecting around projects. So there are sort of, I mentioned the Millers Point project, so suburbs or communities. But then what we were sort of looking at was reshaping the collection principles and I guess collecting principles was to theme-based collection. So with the themes, we took the approach that we could address some universal historical subjects, things that are really fundamental to all human societies and actually all humans. So people always have to live somewhere. They always live in a religious or ideological ethical framework of some kind, even if they don't know it. Human beings are always negotiating between the built and natural environments. People all make a living in some way, and culture is always part of human life. And so our collecting themes are shelter, belief, shared terrain, open all hours, art and culture, and also our city, which is actually alluding to the interviews that really about our local government area. These overarching themes also guide the way that the oral histories are presented online. And you can see here, I've got a screen grab of our oral histories website. The URL for that is sydneyoralhistories, all one word, .com.au. And the interviews are sort of thematically presented in each of that, you know, those sort of, I guess we call them sort of buckets of interviews. So that's, I guess, for us, the best way that we can present our audio content. And we feel that these broad themes lend themselves to an in-depth and ongoing approach to Sydney's history, rather than encouraging simplistic nostalgia. And that sounds a bit harsh, but oftentimes we do get offered interview subjects on the basis that they are elderly, and that is not for us always the best reason to interview someone. We do, you know, obviously we want to interview people that come to us with a story or tell us something different about the city or their life. So the purpose of the themes really is to show the rich diversity of Sydney's history as it's represented in the people who live and work here. So the website was launched in 2013, and I can't believe it. That's 10 years ago. It doesn't really feel like it. And then we revamped it in 2016. It's a WordPress platform. It's, you know, probably not the most modern of interfaces, but nonetheless, it's still doing the job. And it's, you know, we will look to upgrading that at some point. But at the moment, we are really focusing on the presentation of the interviews online. The website showcases around a quarter of the city's oral history interviews, making them accessible to dedicated researchers and casual browsers alike. Since the website was first launched, the historians at the city have been focused on getting a handle actually on what we have in our collection. So, you know, doing a bit of an audit of all of the interviews and actually understanding that we did have 500. We didn't really know how many before that. Digitizing the interviews from cassette format into like a digital format, transcribing all of the interviews and then making them accessible. The other thing to say is when we do interviews with people, they do sign a permission form. And so sometimes people do the interview and then they don't actually want to share that interview. And for us, that is completely within the realm of that person's autonomy. They can make that call. We just keep the interview in our collection and we just keep it private. And other times people specify conditions, so they're happy for it to be accessible, say, to researchers, but they or even online, but they have conditions about, like excising parts of the interview for publication. So as a collection has been becoming more available and accessible online, we've been exploring how the interviews can be used as a source for other historical projects and creative endeavours. And these are projects both created by ourselves, by the city, and also by other people or communities or groups. So among the creative ways that the public and other users are engaging with and using our oral histories are in radio features and podcasts more recently. On hoardings, we've got a photograph here of our bespoke historic hoardings, and we used not audio, you couldn't hear it, but excerpts of, should I say quotes from oral history interviews. We've used oral history sort of snippets in some of the park landscaping, and I'll give an example of where we've done that. In a geolocated app, and I will talk about that as well. That's our app, the Sydney Culture Walks app, for theatrical storyline workshopping, and also in a range of exhibitions. And I will be talking about some of the exhibitions. So I guess the first example I wanted to talk you through is the Sydney Culture Walks app. And so for about 20 years, the city has produced, or rather the city's history team has produced self-guided walking tours that showcase the history, heritage and culture and public art of our local government area. So these have been available as hard copy brochures, which have been distributed to our libraries, community centres and also hotels around the city, and also as PDFs, which can be downloaded from the city's website. Around 10 years ago, we started to make some of this content from our existing suite of self-guided walks available through a smartphone application using GPS and Google Maps and also Apple Maps. The Sydney Culture Walks app was launched in 2014. And as I'm writing all of this, I'm thinking, gosh, 2013 and 14 were really busy years for our team with the development of the app and various websites and such. So this digital technology was great because it really allowed us to enhance the walk experience through the incorporation of audio. In early 2016, we selected some excerpts from our oral history collection to update and augment the Piedmont walk in the app. So Piedmont was one of the first self-guided walking tour brochures, which was produced in 2004. The aim of this walk was to introduce people to the area's industrial and maritime history, but also exploring an often overlooked Sydney community, which was sort of nestled in there behind the CBD across the water. Excerpts were drawn from 2 sets of oral history interviews, which were conducted 13 years apart, and I'll just go through those 2 collections with you. And we've got a slide here that does show those 2 projects. The excerpts were edited and uploaded into the app to match existing sites on the route, but also we did add a few additional sites to the app walk, and that was really to highlight the oral history collection. So we didn't sort of go off track of the route, but we just wanted to really draw out the collection of oral histories. So the 2 projects I was talking about, there was the Piedmont and Ultimo Oral History Project, and this comprised 25 interviews, interviews were done in the mid-1990s when Piedmont was being redeveloped. These interviews, I did mention that we have interviews that were created by other organisations, and this was the Sydney Harbour Authority. There was some sort of redevelopment authority, state government redevelopment authority that was developing Piedmont at the time and became the Sydney Harbour Foreshore Authority ultimately. And so we did get that collection. That was sort of part of the condition that we would make that collection available. And so excerpts from these interviews were compiled in a publication which was called Doors Were Always Open, which was published in 1997. 13 years later, in 2009, the city's oral historian, Margot, did some interviews with 6 people about the former Water Police headquarters at Piedmont Point. So the Water Police site was a piece of prime public land, which was surrounded by tall residential buildings over which a large and very successful anti-development community action was fought. Today, this land has been incorporated into Pirima Park, and we have a photograph of today's Pirima Park there, or in the previous slide rather. So the development of Pirima Park was an early landmark for Clover Moore's pro-community, pro-public space credentials. Former Deputy Mayor Marcel Hoff was instrumental in the community campaign and was interviewed, as were others who were associated with the history of the site and also its development and creation as a park. It really was quite challenging for us to identify appropriate audio to include in the Port Walk. It's not like we were starting from scratch. As I mentioned, there were already walks, it was already, sites on the walk. And we already had a defined route. So there were around 17 sites already. A number of sites in the walk were actually discussed in the oral history interviews that we held already. But often these mentions, they didn't really form a coherent story. So you might imagine it'd be a simple task to pull out an anecdote. But I mean, when you think about it, we rarely talk in nice, rounded, fully formed stories. So people stop mid-sentence, change tack, or go off in a different tangent. People, for example, might talk about a subject early on and then return to it later. So creating a coherent audio excerpt from an oral history interview involved quite a bit of slicing, dicing, and editing of the recorded material. There were other technical issues to consider. So the interviews, particularly the first lot of interviews, I think from the 1990s, they weren't of broadcast quality. They were recorded on cassette tapes and often in loud rooms. And so the recordings were quite crackly, they had echoes, and there were sort of hisses and noises, which actually came from the tape itself, not just the room noise. And so these factors really did constrain some of the material's use and suitability for inclusion in the app. In selecting the audio material, we also had to think about balance. So some people are really great storytellers. They have like vivid stories to tell us, and they also have multiple anecdotes about multiple sites. But really our aim was to get a range of voices and memories and stories into the walk. So the most that anyone is featured is twice. And we also try to not to put their stories on adjacent sites, so sort of space them out across the walk. So really, this is a bit of a curatorial task, but I think just taking the care and time to do this does enhance the experience for the listener or the user of the app as well. Around half of the sites in the Port Walking Tour are augmented with oral history snippets. And this really does provide an intimate way to experience the memories of the people who lived and worked in the area. They bring to the listener their voices, their emotions, and their connection to place. Now, I just want to play for you a clip with Arthur Cox, and he was interviewed in the 1990s. The clip is about 1 minute and 14 seconds long.
We used to have Friday afternoon sport from school, and you either went swimming or you went to Wentworth Park and played cricket or football in the winter. I used to go swimming to Pyrmont Bars. My brother, he taught me to swim. Harold, he was one of the swimmers down there with Scotty Black, Johnny Conlon, Tassie King, and Mr. Watkerson. He was the manager of the bars. There was a council bars. The water was lovely and clean until the steamships start to come in and drop their oil. But he took me down there and he used to take me around the bars on his back. I remember floating on his back with my arms around his neck. And then he'd say, right, and you've got to swim now. He'd hold me up with his hand underneath me till I could swim across the bars. And it was really lovely. And funny down there, it used to be men only on Sunday mornings and mixed bathing Sunday afternoons. And it used to be Hessian. The ladies had their cubicles on top and the men had their cubicles down the bottom. And then they formed all sorts of things down there. They used to have some great times.
And so that was, I think one thing I didn't really explain is like how the app works. So you have the site itself, and then you can play the audio, but then we also have it transcribed as well. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an excerpt about that. So last year, we created a brand new Walk in the App for Darlinghurst. And this was created with the Paul Ramsey Foundation, and shout out to my colleague, Mike Dunn, because he actually pulled that walk together for us. And in the work that Mark did. He drew on oral history interviews from the city's collection, but also he found some other interviews in other institutions. So we've got Skeggs, and there was another school as well, which was had an oral history collection. So we did actually use other collections for this particular walk. The clip I'm going to play now for you is with Marjorie Love, and she's a very long-term resident of Darlinghurst. I think she's 100 this year. And and she's got this wonderful accent and sort of memories of the area.
I've been telling you about when we used to play in the paddock. I was telling you about the post office was there, and then this road went through to St John's Church, and that yellow cabs we used to go through there. And now that's all been built over. They tell me there's flats been built in. You can't go through there anymore. It used to be the depot for the yellow cabs because that was the brand of taxis that were in the city at that time, you know. And that was their base. And anyway, and then there was Burton Street, Liverpool Street. You had a great big hill, big rock underneath that. Have you ever been up Burke Street and Liverpool Street? Just down from Oxford Street where the police station was there. That's not there anymore. But there was a big rock face, like as if the houses the houses on that side of it had all been built out of that rock, you know, because they left this part and then there was a house built on top of it, and then you'd walk up the hill, and I suppose they got tired of chopping through the rock, so they built a house up on top of it, and then just left that, and they left the hill, so we had to walk up the hill then to get to school. So we didn't go that way very often. We mostly went through the yellow cabs or around William Street.
Yeah.
I think what's lovely about that interview, it's sort of like when you have interviews with people about place, is that people have mind maps and they have this sort of shaping, the city is shaped through their memories. And I think that's something that Marjorie really brought to her interview. And she described all the places that she knew and understood and how they changed over time. So just going back to Pyrmont, I wanted to talk to you about another Pyrmont location where we used oral history, but in a more concrete, literally concrete way. And this was in the landscaping of a much-loved park. So Quarry Green is a park on Quarry Street, and it was established in 1983, and it was created following a massive Woolstore fire. Part of the development consent for an apartment block on the site of the Woolstore was that the developer donated land so that the Quarry Street could be widened and also landscaped as a public garden and recreation space, in other words, as a park. So when the park was being upgraded in 2014, the history team was approached by City Projects. So the City Projects team are the people that sort of build and construct things across our cities, including our parks. And they asked us to assist with some interpretation in the park. There was going to be the standard park signage. If you are a resident or a visitor to the City of Sydney, if you go into any of our parks, there's what we call regulation signage or an entry sign. And often on the back of those signs, there's history content. And so that's always important for us to include that. We have around 500 parks and open spaces in our local government area. So providing the sort of the history either of the park or the local area is sort of important. So this was, I mean, obviously we were going to include that in the park, but there was also this opportunity to use some salvaged sandstone in the landscaping and to inscribe it with quotes which were relevant to both the park and Pyrmont more generally. So Quarry Green, as I mentioned, it's essentially a street closure. Quarry Street was named because it led from Harris Street to the sandstone quarries, which were on the western side of the Pyrmont Peninsula. The road used to be called Tarry Hill by local kids, and this was because it was one of the few tar-metalled roads in Pyrmont and Ultimo. It was also one of the steepest hills. So as you can imagine, this steep, smooth road was ideal for wheelbarrow and for billy cart races. So we selected some quotes from the 1990s Pyrmont and Oral History project, where locals who mostly grew up in the area in the 1930s remembered this place because of the billy carts, the wool stores, and also the rival street gangs. So Quarry Street had been the scene of larrikin mob brawls from the 1920s to the 1940s. Most probably these were territorial in nature because the street was actually the demarcation between Pyrmont and Ultimo, and also Glebe further to the west. I mean, we think of our city now as being this quite integrated space, but historically it was quite segmented and sort of street by street. These are very local and very time-specific childhood connections to this very small area, this very small part of Sydney, are really not the type of details which you can normally find in the written historical record. But it is the kind of detail that does come through in recorded oral histories. And these memories are now inscribed on 5 sandstone pieces within the park. And I don't have any audio to share with you, but I'll just read out a quote from Les O'Keefe, who remembered, and I quote, "Coming down the hill one day and there was a timber jinker going along Wattle Street, and I went clean underneath it, beneath the wheels, and shot across the park." So now I just wanted to share with you some of the exhibitions that we've had at Customs House, where probably in the last 5 years, really, where we've drawn upon our oral history collection. So the first exhibition was called Be Live the City. And the brief for this exhibition was to draw on the city's archive in contemporary ways, with the aim of making Sydney's history accessible and relevant to today, inviting reflection on change and imagining new ways of being in the future. So the exhibition curator identified 6 interviews from the collection, which showed what it meant to be and belong in the city. And 6 video artists were then commissioned to reinterpret these oral histories. The videos were shot in black and white, and they provided different perspectives on the city, on city life. And we've got some images here of the audience on the ground floor listening to these oral histories and watching the videos that were linked to it. These videos were presented on a 19-metre media wall, which is on the ground floor of Customs House. And each video was accompanied by a listening station with headphones. And there were captions accompanying each of the videos / oral histories. And these were intended to highlight the oral histories that the videos were inspired by and to invite visitors to reflect upon their own stories. So around the same time, there was an exhibition called Something Else is Alive, Sydney and the Animal Instinct. For this interview, oral histories were incorporated into 2 listening stations. So it's a bit more of a, I guess, maybe a didactic way to present the audio content. There was a listening station on the ground floor and one on level 1, which is what you can see here. This is one of the display cases, and on the end of it, you can see there's some headphones there for people to listen to. So each of the listening stations had an object and also excerpts from the oral histories. 2 of the interviews, one was with John Martin and Richard Major, and the other was with Richard Major, and they both talked about birds in the urban setting. And I'll just, I think we can just play a clip now with Richard Major. The sound quality, this one's a bit lower. He's not as, it just sometimes depends on the way that the interviews are recorded, but it's a bit of a lower pitch. So you probably have to just listen a bit more for this one.
About 1975, we first started to get breeding records, and there were not very many of them. It's been, the last 20 years probably that the numbers of breeding birds have really increased so that currawongs are staying here year round. I think it's partially a catch-up time. It takes time for populations to grow and learn. The other interesting side of the currawong story is that we now get more channel bill cuckoos, which is a nest parasite. So they're a cuckoo that lay their eggs in the nests of currawongs particularly, and then the currawongs bring up the channel bill cuckoo babies. When currawongs weren't breeding in Sydney, we didn't really get channel bill cuckoos. Now channel bill cuckoos are something that is very widely noticed by urban residents right through into Hyde Park at the time of year when channel bill cuckoos come through. There's channel bill cuckoos at Hyde Park and Belmore Park next to Central Railway Station, probably around the university. I'm not sure, but they're something that comes right through the city, tracking changes in currawongs. So they just wouldn't be here if there weren't currawongs for them to nest in. They have a very loud, quite raucous call, which they'll make when flying over to or sitting in trees.
Yes, I don't, not a big fan of Channel Bill cuckoos, I have to say, but it's good to understand the reason why. So the next thing I wanted to share with you is about an exhibition about the 175th anniversary of the City of Sydney Council. And so for that exhibition, we also drew upon our oral history collection. I actually was tasked to select 5 audio clips, and these were quite short actually. And we created a QR code so that visitors in the exhibition could download the audio and also listen to the clips on their smartphone. And the exhibition space was in Lower Town Hall. So the idea was really, instead of having the listening space, was to use the technology of the smartphone, actually the QR code. One thing I'll say is that this exhibition was in 2017, and all of the information we were getting was that QR codes were dead. No one uses QR codes. They're on their way out. But we stuck with it and we did use a QR code. And as we know, things have really changed with our relationship to QR codes. So yeah, just to say, this is a different approach to having a listening station, for example, with the headphones. It was really about, being able to listen to that in the space in your own time. Also, the QR code did allow us to get some analytics on how people listen to the audio content in the space as well, which you don't often get when you're doing the interviews. You don't know how many times people are listening to it if they're doing it in a listening station. So the example I'm going to talk about now is one that actually doesn't involve the City of Sydney's oral history collection, but it does give potential for how we might use oral histories in the future. In 2017, I co-curated with Nina Mile at the Contemporary Art Space Carriageworks an exhibition to mark the centenary of the Great Strike of 1917. This was one of Australia's largest industrial conflicts. Held at Carriageworks in July and August 2017, the exhibition displayed historical objects alongside commissioned artworks that responded to this watershed moment. So the presentation of oral history testimony was an important element of the exhibition, and this was so that audiences had an opportunity to listen to the voices of people who had directly experienced the strike. The key collection that I drew upon was the Bicentennial Oral History Project. And this is held in a few different places, primarily the State Library of New South Wales and the National Library of Australia, which is actually where I got the audio from. And these interviews now are pretty much all available online. It's such a great collection, and they've got them online. You can listen to the audio. They also have the shot listings and sort of summaries, so you can listen to excerpts and things like that. However, when I did this project, they were not available online. So I did have to go through quite manually the collection, but I'm so pleased that they're all available now for people to use and to listen to. So the Bicentennial Oral History Project contains 200 interviews with New South Wales residents. The interviews were carried out in 1987 and 1988. And these life history interviews include personal experiences from people from a range of social classes, occupations and places across New South Wales. It was such a great project, I think, the Bicentennial was remembered for a few different things, good and bad, but I think that's a really great legacy piece, I think, because it gives us these voices. Some of the people in the collection were born in the 19th century, for example. What's remarkable about this collection is that a quarter of the people interviewed remembered the 1917 strike. The majority of those interviews were either children or teenagers when the strike broke out. Only one of the interviews in the Bicentennial Oral History Collection is with a striker. And there are actually 2 interviews with strike breakers. And there's a great interview in there with a guy who wasn't in Australia, who was actually away fighting the war, but he's got a very good recall of the strike as well, which I guess goes to show the power of the union movement and collective memory. So the remainder of the 50 interviews, so these are the 50 interviews where people do talk about the strike. These are with people whose family members went on strike, others whose families didn't strike at all. So it was sort of, they're asking the question and then they would actually say, I remember it, but we weren't involved, for example. Others who still who were affected by the strike as well, just more broadly in day-to-day life. Most remembered the associated hardship, in particular the food shortages which were brought about by the strike, and also the lack of transport. It was a transport strike, so it meant you couldn't really move around the city unless you were a scab. Then there's others who were asked a question about the strike, but actually didn't remember it at all. Most likely that was because of their age, or because they or their family were not politically engaged in any way, or they were not really affected by the strike in any sort of day-to-day way. Excerpts for 9 of these oral history interviews were selected for the exhibition. I've got the slide here that shows we actually got this great railway seat from Medlow Bath, which was in, I think it was the paint shop next door. Was there was a sort of a small collection of railway memorabilia in another adjoining warehouse building. And we moved that into the space. And then we had 3 different listening stations where you could sit on the railway bench and just immerse yourself in the audio. So selected excerpts from 9 and then edited the interviews down, and the clips that are selected range from 30 seconds to 30 minutes, and then created 3 separate tracks. And the interviews were grouped together into 3 broad themes. So flashpoint, impact, and loyalty. They also, rather than just presenting the raw sound, they were actually sort of laid into a bed of sound, and they had a brief introduction by me. And I do sound very serious, so you can hear, and just wanted to not be the, what do you call? I didn't want to detract from the interviews, but I may have, in fact, now that I listen to them again. And then there was also a wall caption so people could understand. So this is a bit longer, this section. This is 3 minutes and 51 seconds. And this is the impact theme. And the interviewees are Gwen Green, Foreman Crawford, and Bernie Johnson.
Gwen Green was a young girl living at Randwick and recalls the hardship caused by the strike.
Do you remember the 1917 general strike? Yes, I do. It was terrible. Everything stopped. I can't describe how dreadful it was, because bread wasn't being made, trams and trains ceased. Living was impossible for those particularly who didn't have any reserves. People with enough money to have foreseen that it would happen had accumulated flour and sugar and so forth. But it was really a very bad time. Who did you sympathise with in that? Well, I'm afraid I sympathise with the people who are striking, because in my opinion, they are not really very well treated. And this, I suppose, stems from the fact that my father was such a liberal thinker, and he'd imbued us with his own kind of thoughts, and we were sympathetic to those less fortunate.
Foreman Crawford was a strikebreaker from regional New South Wales who must have ventured into enemy territory in the Domain during the heady days of the strike.
The processions that the strikers used to have, they'd be marching up the roads, and when it came to a Sunday, everybody in Sydney nearly would be in the Domain on Sunday, and the strikers also, they'd march onto the Domain, and they would be calling out, will we go back to work? And like the leaders would say, will we go back to work? And they'd all yell out, no. And they had a few other things that they used to sing out. Can the cockies do our work? And then their company would sing out, no. Can we milk their cows? Yes. Will we give the cockies corn? No. Yes, who stole the monkey's playground? The cockies. And of course, they could do everything. But as time went on, we found each week they got a little bit weaker. And we could see that they weren't so confident. And as we went to our work, we'd be taken by a tram or by a motor lorry or something, and we'd see the strikers' wives as we went through some of the suburbs. and they'd begin scratching themselves, and they would sniff, and they'd smell the gum leaves. Of course, they were ridiculing us all the time.
Bernie Johnson was a kid living at Surrey Hills who remembers the street processions passing his house.
I lived only one street back from Surrey Hills, and when the strikers used to march past, going down Elizabeth Street, so there'd be the Army and Tramway band, you know, beautiful band, and hundreds of blokes marching behind it. And then as time went by, the band gets smaller and smaller, the crowd gets smaller and smaller, until finally it was just a ragtag rabble going past, you know, in the finish. And that was a bitter thing, because it divided the working class completely. They even formed the two unions, you know, the diehards and the others. That was a very serious thing, because I didn't realise that at the time. I was only a kid, but I can remember it.
So a small snippet of one of the oral history interviews was actually used in a soundtrack we commissioned to accompany an archival black and white film about the strike, which was also in the exhibition. And this interview was with a strike breaker called Foreman Crawford, and you actually just heard from Foreman Crawford just then. And he was hands down the best informant about the strike, like the recall that he had about the chants in the Domain, like that's extraordinary, really. You can't, I've not heard that in any other interview about the strike. We also created a podcast to complement and promote the exhibition, and to also explore the history of the 1917 strike and its legacies through sound. This podcast, it's around 20 minutes long. It was scripted and co-created by me and also narrated by me, and includes excerpts from 13 of the interviews. The intention of the podcast was to highlight this important but relatively underexplored aspect of Australian history using a range of sounds. So the oral histories, but then also narration, music and sound effects. So a listening audience could learn more about this event, reflect and understand its complexity from various viewpoints. So COVID-19, as we know, has reshaped our world. And this is no news to anyone listening in today or being here in this room. But, you know, it's interesting about those sort of big world events. It's obviously does terrible things, but also, I guess, gives us different ways to be and to imagine the future. And so when we're in lockdown, one of the things that the history team did was to deliver a lot of talks, I think something like 45 public facing talks. And we had great audiences because there were people hungry for information and news and entertainment, because we were all sort of in our separate bubbles, as it were. And we presented a lot of these talks online via Zoom. So we had to, the word we use is pivot. So we had to sort of pivot and sort of find new ways of presenting our content to audiences. And presenting audio actually in our public programs has always been a bit of a challenge due to some of the technical issues involved. And I guess sometimes, you know, we had that a little bit at the beginning of our talk, but I guess sometimes, you know, it's just been a bit of a challenge for us to, I guess, apart from having the website presentation about how we can actually present audio and our oral histories. But it really did lend itself well to online presentation. So we produced a few sessions that really honed in on our oral histories, which we did record as part of History Week events. And so you can actually catch up with some of these on the History Council's YouTube channel. My colleague Lisa, the former city historian, she drew on our oral history collection for stories about Sydney siders and how they faced hardship and resilience during the 1930s economic depression. And very topically, I mined our oral history collection for some stories about the Spanish flu. This, of course, was another pandemic which reshaped Sydney almost 100 years ago. I'm going to play you a clip from Billy Pascoe, and he lived in Woolloomooloo and had some great recollections about the Spanish flu. The sound quality for this one's not great. I don't know if it's actually the sound quality or actually Billy's sort of patination, the way that he speaks. And this clip's about 2 minutes long.
Straight after that, we got the flu. And I think everyone in Woolloomooloo had the flu. They cut all schools were stopped, everything stopped. If you walked outside, you had to have a mask on, and there was no cure. All you done was go to bed, and anyone that was up. The only cure there was, they used to have vinegar and brown paper. That was the only. There's no Aspros them days, nothing like that. Never heard of it. They had Aspros. That was unheard of in 1920. So all you done, you went to bed and you stayed there for 4 or 5 days. They were dying like flies. They had trains run up rocks to it with that big red cross on them. They take, the hospitals were all full, and they took them out the showground. Put them where the horses and cattle, all that was. That's where they all finished up. Well, we just hadn't been over that 6 months, then the bubonic plague come. That was, with all the rats, that war come back through the war too. And that's where the flu come. There was more killed with the flu than was killed in the war. They were killed in hundreds and thousands. Every street just had poor old so-and-so's gone. Oh, so 2 in one house. They died like flies. And they were cured for it. It was no good. Well, that's the only thing there was. To keep the fever down, they give you vinegar and brown paper. I don't know why the brown paper come in.
But what did they do with it? This brown paper.
Because they get the fever down.
But they put it on the chest.
No, on the forehead.
What, brown paper soaked in vinegar.
Soaked wouldn't put on your forehead. And you laid in bed then and they died for about 10 days, I think it was before you got over it.
Did you get it?
Everyone got it. Everyone in the house had it. I think everyone in the street had it. But the fact, I think they didn't all have it together. It went for 3 months, I say, roughly. But over a period of 3 months, I don't know anyone didn't get it. Because somebody had inhaled somewhere. That was it. Someone else would catch it. As soon as you breathed out. That was caught.
And did you know any people who died?
Oh, 100. I was only young at the time, but you'd hear them saying, Mr. So-and-so, and even young kids, like 4 or 5 year old, and respecting that one, and anyone 16 or 17, and people 50 and 60, you didn't have to be 50 or 60 to die, but, and there's nothing you could do about it.
That sounds terrible.
It was terrible.
The thing just to quickly say about that, we are about to wrap up. The thing to say about that is actually about the nature of memory. He does talk about the Spanish flu quite descriptively, but then he also mentions the bubonic plague. And there was an outbreak of bubonic plague in 1900, and actually in subsequent years, like sort of every year in the summer, there were sort of minor outbreaks of the bubonic plague. But I think what's interesting about the oral history interviews is that people actually conflate those 2 illnesses and they sort of bring them together. And I think that's just, in a sense, some sort of response to the trauma, and it would have been something that they would have lived through or their families would have lived through, and they would have been in a collective memory as well. So just to wrap up, and in conclusion, ensuring that our oral histories are discoverable online is really assisting us with broader creative engagement with this important collection. And we really hope that this will only grow in the coming years ahead. We welcome you to dip into the oral history collection online. There's plenty of stories to be found. And I would also just like to give a shout out to my colleague who's here in the room, Sue Anderson, who's done some recent work with us to make those oral histories accessible and public as well in more recent times. As mentioned at the start of the talk, we do have a feedback survey. There's a QR code on the screen right now. We're going to, I think, maybe post the link in the chat. If it's not in the chat, we'll definitely be sending an email around to everyone in the next couple of days. This is your chance to tell us what you did or didn't enjoy, how we can improve these talks for you, and also what history talk topics that you might be interested in hearing from the City of Sydney's history team. I don't know if we've got any time for questions. Both? Yeah. We'll go for an online. Yeah.
So we have 2 now. First one is, are any of the exhibitions and audiovisual creations mentioned available in archives, such as the 1917 Great Strike?
The 1917 strike is not available in archives, but it is available in sort of certain ways. It's one of the challenges of when you curate or make an exhibition is not everything of it can remain. It's sort of a temporal experience or bringing together of resources. I guess the podcast in a way is the legacy piece of that. Also, we did produce a catalogue publication, which is, I'm not really sure how and where you might get that, but it was definitely available through Carriage Works. So that is another way to experience that exhibition. And there's photographs of it online. So if anyone's like super interested, I can, if you send an email to history@cityofsydney.nsw.gov.au, we can sort of provide photographs and things like that on other resources. I've got a question from the room.
Hi, and thanks very much for the great presentation. Just got a question about First Nations content in the archives. Out of the 500 that you mentioned, roughly any idea of how many or percentage? And also, is it possible to search the archives by such keywords?
Yeah, we do. So we actually, the way, I'll just answer your last point first. So the way that the Oral Histories website is structured is that there are tags. And so when we are uploading the interviews into the website, there's actually tags, and these are ways to search for the interviews. And we have a collection in there, which was, I think it's around about 15 to 20 interviews, which were conducted I think it was about 2017 when we put a memorial into, or a memorial, I guess it's a memorial in a sense, in Hyde Park for Aboriginal servicemen and women. And that artwork is called Yin and Majimi. And so as part of that project, we did oral history interviews with servicemen and women and their families. And so that is available on the website under the belief section. In our collection, apart from that collection, we would have, I think, around 20 to 30 interviews with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and people. Another collection, which is a discrete collection, is about the Redfern Apology Day. So when Kevin Rudd gave his apology, I wasn't working at the city at that time, but my colleagues, Lisa Murray and Margot Beasley, went down to the Redfern Community Centre and interviewed some, not really the way we normally do interviews. It was actually more sort of vox pops. And so we do have those interviews in our collection, but also on the Oral Histories website, there's a video which brought together photographs from the day and also the audio content.
And one last question from online. If we were to use the oral histories for creative or historical writing, is there a preferred way of referencing them and acknowledging the library?
Yes, there is. But I think I would just say consistency. So I would just, when I cite an oral history interview, I would say who the interview is conducted by, who it is with, the year that it was conducted, and also the project, if it's known, and the subject matter of the interview. My suggestion would just to be keep it simple. Of course, the other thing is really important to mention is actually where the interview is from. So you would say the City of Sydney Oral History Collection, and a link, if it exists, a URL link to the website. So I think, do we have any more questions from the room, or are we ready to wrap it up? Oh, yeah, we've got one more.
You were talking about, since the advent of QR code use, that you're able to track some of the stats. Has the Oral History Group already looked at some of the stats, or is there plans to, so that we can find out how much use there is?
Look, the QR code, obviously that was a sort of a one-off thing for the exhibition. And to be honest with you, I did sort of like look at the paper and I was like, did we actually do that? I think it was the potential of it, but whether or not it was followed up, I'm not quite sure. We do, because it's a website, we do have Google Analytics, so we can measure the use. The thing I would say is that the I can't think of it, but the SEO and the sort of the way that the website is configured is actually not very optimal for actually forward facing. And to be on, that's something that actually I have raised with our web team, is to get that happening, because there's sometimes, like, I know that we've just uploaded an oral history interview in our collection. I do Google search and I cannot find it. So, and I think that is in part because of the platform that it's on. And, you know, it's something we need to optimize. But, you know, certainly we've been giving, because of the theme of History Week this year, we've been giving our oral histories a bit of a push. And so I'm really interested to see if that's going to be reflected in some of the statistics as well. So, yeah, great question. And I think, yeah, look, that really is something that's really important to track, I think. Thank you. So I think that that's it for us today. Thank you for joining us here in the room today and also online. Please stay safe and enjoy the rest of History Week. Thanks so much.